bringing national topics that matter to Oklahoma. With Congressman Tom Cole. This is Cole on Congress.
Thank you for joining me today for today's episode of Cole on Congress. And today I'm genuinely pleased to have my colleague, my very good friend, and frankly one of the senior members of Congress, been elected since 1986, Fred Upton from the great state of Michigan. And in his long career, among the many things he did, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but he chaired really one of the most powerful committees in Congress for 6 consequential years, the Energy and Commerce Committee, which extraordinarily important to Oklahoma, but honestly important to everybody in every state, and did it just brilliantly. He's also a veteran of the Reagan administration, which a lot of people don't know about you, so he's seen government from both sides, having worked at the Reagan White House, as I recall, and obviously in Congress for a lot of years. So I can't tell you what a pleasure it is. I'm genuinely honored to have you take the time to be on the show.
It was
like
an
this.
easy yes. When your staff reached out, it was an easy yes. I said, sign me up.
Well, it's just a pleasure to have you. And let me start out, and number one, we have a sad connection in some ways. We both were great friends of the late Aubrey McClendon, and tell us a little bit about that. But first, if you would, walk us through your career, because it's a pretty extraordinary career, Fred.
Well, I have been pretty fortunate. I graduated from the University of Michigan, so I'm a Wolverine. I sleep in the basement when they lose.
We respect people that like football. We honor that.
I'll confess right now, I have a license plate that says BT OSU, but it's not Oklahoma State, all right?
That's okay.
There's this other little town in Columbus, Ohio. Yeah. Anyway, that's so Boehner didn't like me when he was Speaker when I parked next to the House steps. But I've been very fortunate. I graduated from the University of Michigan. I had a chance to work on a congressional campaign. I came to Washington as a staffer. I was the go-to guy on constituent service. Then I had the chance to work at the White House under President Reagan. And
what did you do at the White House?
So at the end, I was in charge of congressional affairs at the Office of Management and Budget. So I was the one that lobbied all the members on every fiscal issue, House and Senate. And President Reagan, we had a Democratic Congress back then, but he had a great success record. His second term, of course, he won 49 states. But he got things done, and his motto was, I'll work to get 80% of the equation right, and to live another day to get the other 20%. So, great agenda. A lot of good things happened. It was a tough time in the world with the Cold War and everything else, and then had a number of folks from my hometown ask me to come back and run for Congress, but I was happily married. I had 2 black labs. I got to salute the Marine Guard going into the West Wing for a variety of things, and I said, no, thank you. And they came back to me a few months later, and I ended up running and winning and been reelected with a pretty good margin ever since.
Well, I tell you, that Reagan influence, it's funny how conservatives remember him, I think, as opposed to reality sometimes. I actually worked in the Reagan campaign in '84, pretty far down the food chain as a state director, but
that's pretty good.
You get to work with guys like Ed Rollins and obviously work for the president. It was pretty exciting, but I always remind people around here we've become so partisan, polarized, and you actually are one of the great masters at putting coalitions together. And we're going to talk about that in connection with the Cures Bill, which may be the most significant thing that the Congress did in the last session. But, Ronald Reagan did that all the time. As you pointed out, he always had a Democratic House. So all those tax cuts, he had to get Democratic votes. He actually touched the last guy to seriously reform entitlements, basically saved the Social Security system for a couple of generations. And, of course, the great centerpiece of the second term was tax reform, which, he had a Democratic senator carrying the lead.
And we haven't done it since.
Exactly.
Needs to happen this year, let's hope.
We should learn a few things from the master about, and nobody ever doubted that he was a pretty good Republican and a pretty partisan Republican. And I actually remember the late David Broder writing a wonderful column about him near the end of the presidency, what a great party president he had been. He had rebuilt the Republican Party. And that was true, and yet he knew how to sit down and cut deals, and you have that same sort of ability.
Well, we both have great teams that work with us and for us, and couldn't do the job without a terrific staff, and I was blessed to have that when I was Chairman of Energy and Commerce, and delighted to have many of the same people now as I chair the Energy Subcommittee.
Well, we're going to get to energy, but I want you to tell us a little bit about 21st Century Cures, which you were the architect of. I actually work a little bit as on the appropriating side
more
of
than
that,
a little bit
of that deal. But this legislation, and I want you to talk a little bit about the different elements of it and how you put it together in such a contentious era, because this is something brought Republicans and Democrats together, reformed in dramatic ways the manner in which we go about trying to cure disease and approve drugs and modernize our healthcare system, which is a contentious area. Nobody else has been able to find a bipartisan way to do it but you, and then put additional resources as well out at the National Institute of Health. So it's just a masterpiece, and moved through remarkably well.
Well, we did something that often Congress is accused of not doing, that is listening. So we did a lot of spade work. We listened to all the different factors here, the disease groups, cancer, diabetes, lupus, MS, the researchers, the pharmaceutical industry, even the venture capitalists. The venture capitalists told us that by a 50% margin, they were stopping investing in America. They were going overseas because they could not get the approvals for these drugs and devices, whether it be a new knee or a new hip or whatever. It was twice as long if they invested here in the U.S., and they would rather go overseas, get the approval there, than manufacture it over there, and they were off to the races. That's how they got the return on their dollar. And we know that it's usually $1 billion or $2 billion for a successful drug to actually get to the marketplace. Well, if you can keep the safety record and shorten that span by a number of years, not only are you going to reduce the cost, but that family that's suffering with that ill patient, they're going to be much better off too. And we also know that, a disease like Alzheimer's, it's going to cost Medicare $1 trillion in benefits in the year 2050. So to me,
$259 billion right now.
Yeah. So it's like, what can we do? So we had a lot of hearings all over the country. It was bipartisan from the get-go. It actually took more than one Congress. We started in the previous Congress to get it done. But we also came up with more money for research. You were a big player with me back in the 90s when we doubled the money for the National Institutes of Health, and just a marvelous organization that's done so well. But then because of the sequester, and budget cuts and that type of thing, it was in essence level funding that maybe even went down in some years. And so we said we've got to have more money, and you as a very influential friend and chairman of that Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee helped us, and we found a way to help you find offsets. Remember, we both are fiscal conservatives, and for me, when we raised spending, we needed to find an offset, so we didn't increase the deficit, and we did in jurisdiction within our committee. But in essence, we could take credit for increasing the NIH over a 10-year span of $45 billion. And you've been a big part of that and a partner. And, I had a researcher in my office a couple weeks ago now. He's been researching for a cure for adrenal cancer, sort of one of those rare cancers, doesn't impact, it's fatal when it gets there. But he is convinced that because of that NIH money that he got, he is convinced that within a month or two, they're going to get his drug approved, and they are going to...
Wow.
So that's the miracles that we see. The FDA just approved the new artificial pancreas a little bit earlier this year. We also worked with the FDA, of course, Food and Drug Administration, because we said, we're going to demand you all to do more. Tell us what you need. And they said, well, we need more help, more funds, and we did it. So at the end, we passed this bill 392 to 26 in the House. I want to say it was 92 to 8 in the Senate, but we needed every day. I mean, literally, it was the last day of the session when this all came together. It was bipartisan. President Obama signed it into law in December, but it was a great effort. We had a lot of times we went home thinking that it was never going to happen. But at the end, all the planets were aligned right, and the vote was there.
Yeah,
and we got
I remember
it done.
thinking at the time, because I know how significant all these reforms and processes were in addition to the resources. I actually think long term they will actually prove more significant, but regardless, it takes both. You got to spend money to work in these areas. But I thought, you know, it's almost too bad it's so overwhelming, the vote, because it obscures how tough it was to do the work. And you get more coverage on great conflict and great showdowns. But I mean, this is something that literally will affect the lives of every single American. Right. And it's one of the things in the world we do better than anybody else. And this is, I had a group in yesterday in the office from Africa and from India to talk about HIV research and what we've done through President Bush's effort on that so-called PEPFAR legislation and what a difference it's made. And that rebounds to the credit of the United States all over the world. I mean, it really, it's much better than another, you know, another wing of aircraft or another aircraft carrier battle group. I mean, if people like you, they don't go to war with you, and they work with you. And these people are so appreciative of the leadership of the United States because we literally have done things that have helped them that there's no way they could do for themselves. And it's helped ourselves at the same time.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's why it's important that we have the NIH there, that they work. You know, it's very competitive. And we have a great director, Francis Collins, who's there. He stayed through a couple different administrations. Of course, you know, he was a professor at Michigan before he started this.
Well, I did not know that. So, but you're allowed to have a little, you know, pardonable parochial pride in something like that. The guy that leads the effort to map the human genome is one of the great scientists of his generation. And but as you say, I know you were very instrumental and worked hard to see that President Trump did reappoint him. And so did our friend Roy Blunt in the Senate, and Lamar Alexander and myself as well. A lot of people were involved in that. And that's one the president ought to get a little credit for, frankly.
Well, you want a professional there. You want someone who's been around the track. And we got to get the job done because, you know what? Disease doesn't hit just Republicans or Democrats. It is non-discriminatory.
Well, as your committee obviously does a lot more than just health care. There's literally no part of the economy that it doesn't touch. But I think in a lot of this is in your tenure as well. I mean, one of the great stories of the last decade is the United States achieving effectively North American energy independence. And I know you had a lot to do with changing the regulatory scheme. So I want you to talk a little bit about the things that have happened in the last few years that have helped lead to this renaissance of American oil and gas, and also how you see the energy situation going forward, because we have everything from climate change to new kinds of technologies that produce energy much more cheaply coming on, renewables. You've touched and dealt with the whole mix.
Well, excuse me 1 second, I'm an all of the above guy. So that's renewables, that's safe nuclear, that's coal, clean coal, it's all those different things. But as you say, we have made remarkable changes over the last couple of years. I can remember when I came as a staffer. I lived on Capitol Hill, so I walked to and fro. And I met after one summer in D.C. in the summer, it was so hot, I said, I'm going to get in a beach house with somebody. So, you know, off the weekend, I went to the Delaware beaches, but you needed a full tank of gas, and back then we had this oil embargo. We had gas lines. I would take I had a license plate that ended in a 1, and on odd days I could fill up my car with gas. And I would take that odd day during the week and go to the local gas station and fill up so that I could drive back and forth. Today we're exporting. We're exporting now. Some days, you know, a million barrels a day. I mean, it is incredible. And that was an act of Congress. We got it done, worked with you all, because it was in an appropriation bill to get it done. And so we have gone from being...
Define what it is, because they won't... But lifting the ban. We literally were not allowed to sell American...
We're the only country in the world not allowed to export a product that is actually derived here.
Exactly right.
And we were sending $1 billion a day sometimes to those OPEC nations, so balance of trade, everything else. But because of technology, because of what we've been able to do with safe fracking, something that's been done for 60, 80 years, the new technologies that we have, not only on oil, but also now on gas production as well, the refinery, all the different savings that we have, you know, even mileage standards increasing for automobiles in terms, you know, from 8 miles a gallon, which we were back in the 70s, to where we are today. 25, 30 miles per gallon is not unheard of, let alone the electric cars. But we are now creating, you know, the jobs here. and we are able to export, and we're able to trade the different levels of oil from light crude to heavy. So we use a different blend over in Europe. Of course, they use mostly diesel. That's not us. We're unleaded gasoline over here. But we now are creating the jobs, being able to export this, actually getting revenue then back to the Treasury, to the U.S. Treasury, reducing the deficit, and particularly in the oil states, Oklahoma being one, Texas, I mean, North, South Dakota, et cetera, the Gulf, we're so much better off, let alone as a national security issue where we can look out for ourselves and not have to be dependent upon somebody overseas.
Well, and we can even help, one of our great challenges in Europe is literally Russia's ability to blackmail European countries because it provides most of their natural gas.
Yeah, they
want to
break
have
up.
to be that way anymore. We can export so much natural gas.
Yeah, well, and we've done that too in our committee. We've expedited the process that allows the Department of Energy to approve these LNG exports. We've been doing that again for a while, but as you've been to Eastern Europe, I've been to Eastern Europe. You take Ukraine, we had their leader, Prime Minister Poroshenko, here a little bit earlier this week. Mm-hmm. They're scared to death of the Russians. They know that the Russians want to break up NATO. They already took Crimea. They want to keep them under their thumb. And with high energy prices, we can help liberate the world, pro-democracy, by allowing the export of LNG, not only to our friends and neighbors in Eastern Europe, but as you look at Japan, which is of course going to be taking nuclear out after Fukushima, but we got another big bill coming up in the next week or two. It'll be on the House floor. John Shimkus has done a super job. He's one of our chairmen of the Environment Subcommittee. High-level nuclear waste. We finally are going to deal with this in what I think will be a pretty good bipartisan vote. So that
we're going to be able to go to Yucca Mountain finally.
That's where we're going.
We got a big investment out there.
We've already spent 15, 20 billion there already, and really thanks to Harry Reid. I say that with a smile, the former minority leader in the Senate. Yeah, he's no longer there, but he was single-handedly able to block Yucca Mountain from getting done, and here we are 30, 40 years from when President Reagan first signed that bill. We need to deal with high-level nuclear waste. I've got 2 nuclear facilities in my district. We've got a closed one further north in Michigan. But we need one safe place to deposit this rather than literally 100 different sites around the country. And that's what this Shimkus legislation is going to do when we begin to move it through the process.
That is one of my frustrations indirectly is I think we actually are being very legislatively productive. In even the last Congress where we had divided government, you got things like finally the first multi-year highway bill done in a decade. You got major overhaul of the Veterans Department. We got your bill, Cures, through the Congress and signed. And it was actually a pretty productive Congress the last 2 years. And if anything, the pace is greater right now. I mean, obviously there are things like health care and taxes that have not yet come to be. But if you just look at what's moved across the floor of the House, over 150 bills, some of them very significant, things like the repeal of Dodd-Frank, which in my state is huge, or any state with a lot of community banks that are suffering.
Credit unions.
Yeah, and you look at, I want to give the Senate its due, that the confirmation of Justice Gorsuch, that's a big, Congress is actually getting a lot more done than the common perception is out there.
Well, we are. We're getting a lot of bills moving through the committee, and frankly, we did I want to say 10 energy bills on the House floor that all passed with an overwhelming vote, over 400 votes or a voice vote in terms of getting things done. Hydroelectric power, again, good renewable, no emissions. It's important for states, particularly in the Northwest and the East, where you've got able to have dams and rivers and be able to use that for generate electricity. But 2 big items, and you're right, Dodd-Frank. I hosted a small business, I was a participant in a small business forum a couple weeks ago at one of my universities. Small business forum, the #1 issue for all of them, cost of capital.
Yeah.
The changes that we made on Dodd-Frank, still keeping those regulations in place for the big banks, Wall Street, but for the community bankers and the credit unions and the smaller institutions, they now have a choice. And if they can lower the cost of capital, small business is where it is. And we're a state that we've cut our unemployment rate by almost 2/3 in the last 6-8 years.
Well, and I tell you, I'm very proud of Congress, these Congressional Review Acts, which again, you got to be a pretty serious legislator to dig into this, but we've probably done more to deregulate the economy than any Congress in modern history. And working with the White House, obviously going back on doing every administration has that last few months spate of regulations where they write everything they could ever dream of, and that they never wanted to have to live under themselves, but sure want to stick on to the next guy. And for us to go back, that tool, as you know better than me, because it was created when you were here and during Speaker Gingrich's era, but it never been used more than one time. And to get 14 of them across that literally are saving billions of dollars of unnecessary regulatory burden on consumers and businesses was a huge deal. And it's almost as if it never happened.
Yeah, and it's called jobs. That's what it means here at home, right. Jobs.
Yeah. Well, you, again, you have your finger on the pulse of all kinds of energy. So as you look forward, we've done some great things up to this point. What do you see as the big challenges in the energy field, and what are the things that we ought to be working on to try and keep the cost of energy here low, which it's lower than just about any major country in the world, and also keep us in the forefront of things like renewables and things like technological innovation?
Well, it's all coming. So technology is a big piece of this, and that's what's allowed us to find these fields that were dry before. We're doing, we've upgraded pipeline safety standards twice now in the last 8 years, and so bigger fines, but higher standards to make sure that we don't have the spills that maybe we had before. And of course, that's the cheaper way, most productive way to get it to the marketplace. But again, you think about when President Obama came into office, the gas price was $3.84 a gallon. I filled up last night for $2.15. So that's way under, take effect inflation and everything else. But we are now competitive. We have such a competitive advantage versus the rest of the world, and we can do it ourselves. So you look at the advances now in Michigan. I don't know about Oklahoma. Michigan, we have a renewable portfolio standard.
17% of our electricity is wind driven.
And so we're going to be 15 in Michigan. So you're a little bit ahead of us, but we don't have
we
the
got a little
solar.
more wind than you do.
Probably have a little more sun as well. Remember, I got the Upper Peninsula.
True.
Michigan is not just this. We got the Upper Peninsula as well. But we're going to make that standard. We've got the wind turbines that are out there. We got solar is making some real advances as well. We've got some hydro, obviously the safe nuclear, which has no emissions. Natural gas, we're fine. We've got old abandoned wells now where we know that there's a ton. There's billions.
That's one of the great things is that when people talk about energy states, really, I mean, and you have to give the private sector the credit here. But they have effectively created new energy states or recaptured old ones. You got Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, places like that we don't think of as energy states. They once were, but now they are again. I mean, the reserves are incredible that they're beginning to find, and that suggests that we can, keep prices at a reasonable level for the average American. And for American businesses.
For decades to come.
Yeah.
For decades to come.
And I'm always a big defender of the energy industry. If you are from Oklahoma, you would be. But, the biggest single raise most Americans have gotten in the last decade has been that decline in gasoline prices and what it costs literally to cool and heat their home.
Yeah.
Huge expense.
And who does it impact most? The most vulnerable.
Right.
Because they're the ones with the older vehicles, maybe not with the insulation. They still have to get to work, take their kids to school, go to the market, all those different things. They are locked into what used to be a much higher gas price, and now they get the real benefit of gas where it is today. It's a big savings.
Tell me a little bit, and this isn't a big thing in our state, but it interests me a great deal. How do you see the future of nuclear? There's obviously lots of challenges here in terms of the permitting and the cost and what it takes. And yet, and there's a certain amount of risk, as the Japanese can tell you. On the other hand, it's clean, it's inexhaustible, it's got a lot of advantages as well.
Well, a couple things. First of all, we do have to solve the high-level nuclear waste issue. So I've got a facility that's going to be closing, if it's not in the next year or two, certainly within the next 5 years. That high-level nuclear waste is already being contained and has been for decades on the shores of Lake Michigan, and ultimately it's got to go. And we want one safe place for it. And so this bill that, again, I believe will be bipartisan and will ultimately get to the president's desk is going to deal with that as a long-term issue, and we're still probably 30, 40 years away from actually seeing the shipments go if it is Yucca Mountain, where it's likely to be. But what's happened with nuclear, and there's been some real advantages, many of these plants were built in the 70s and 80s. A couple of new ones have been permitted, and construction has stopped and started because natural gas prices.
Is so cheap.
It's so cheap.
We've it's been a blessing to our state, obviously, in many ways, but it obviously has put a lot of pressure on nuclear, puts a lot of pressure on coal.
Yeah, but you want that balance so that you're not totally dependent
Absolutely.
on just one source. So, and we also need to continue to make sure we educate nuclear engineers, whether we need them for the military and our ships. And my nephew was on a nuclear sub and had a nuclear engineering degree.
You have very famous nephews and nieces.
I got a few of them. He was on the Tulsa. He was on the sub, the USS Tulsa. Yep. He was on that ship for a couple of years. So, but we need that educated force. We need to deal with the byproduct, the high-level nuclear waste. I'm actually one that believes we ought to recycle it, as the French do, and some others, and that'll come along, I hope, someday. But we need that balance, and we've done well on the renewable side. Again, 17% of Oklahoma, it's mandated now. Michigan, 15%. We're on a little bit of a glide ramp to get there. But once we get that, then you can look to the next level as well. So we're excited about the future on the energy side, that's for sure.
Well, you really, again, your committee ranges over the entire economy. We've got a couple minutes left. If you're thinking about the economic future of the United States, there's a lot of sometimes gloom and doom, and can we compete with the Chinese? I mean, I think we can compete with anybody on just about anything. But what's your outlook for our prospects over the next decade, and what are the things we would need to do to tap our potential?
The most important thing we can do right now, I think, is tax reform. I have a couple of big companies in my district. Pfizer's we got their largest manufacturing facility in the world. Whirlpool started in my district as part of my family way back when. Stryker medical device manufacturer, a couple of nuclear plants. But as I talk to my round of business leaders throughout my state, and as they come through my office, tax reform is the most important thing we can do. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, and until that rate comes down, our businesses, particularly as they look at the new high-tech jobs and everything else, they're going to look overseas because they compete. These are all global companies, and if they're paying 20% higher rates here,
well, I tell you, to your point, I won't get into the names of the companies, but I have my little stock portfolio, and in the last 18 months, two of those countries I've had to, literally they've moved, and so I'm all of a sudden seeing fees deducted from foreign tax returns. That doesn't bother me. It's the jobs and the corporate headquarters moving someplace else, literally tax driven.
Yeah, that's right. And so tax reform, simplifying the code, taking some of those, closing some of those loopholes, being able to drop the rate. And you'll remember even President Obama in the last debate, or one of his debates with Mitt Romney, talked about lowering the corporate tax rate to 25%. Now Trump started at 15, but read The Art of the Deal. If we can end up with someplace in the low 20s, man, will we be better off? Well, and sends a signal to the business community: invest here.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to be our challenge. We're going to have to end because we're at the end of the show, but hopefully we can have you back here and talk about the great success of tax reform sometime later this year. Chairman, thank you for being here. It is an honor and a privilege to have you, and just thank you for all the contributions you've made to our country over many, many years in many, many capacities.
I've learned a lot from a guy like you.
Oh, yeah. Please.
I have.
Well, we'll stop with all the compliments, and thanks again.
Thanks.
You bet.